Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, we gotta talk about the new album from Rick Ross, titled Mastermind. I gotta be honest here, I have never ever been able to understand Rick Ross's appeal. And at this point, I probably should have an idea on why this guy is famous. But for the life of me, it's just not clicking. Rick Ross released his debut album in 2006, and ever since then, we've been inundated by hits from this guy, none of which have been really able to impress me. His reported best album was Teflon Don back from 2010, and I guess if we're looking for admittedly well-produced luxury porn, I guess Rick Ross delivers, but I gotta admit, that's not a version of escapism that I find attractive or even all that interesting. Maybe it's because I look at that sort of music as walking advertisements for all the brands that he managed to cram into his songs for all the product placement money, and sure, I get the appeal of luxury rap, but wouldn't you want a better rapper spitting those lines? Because here's the problem. While he has admittedly gotten better, I've never thought of Rick Ross as a very good rapper at all on a technical level. What's worse is that I can't exactly look past how transparently phony some of the elements of his persona are. Sure, he's rich as all hell. I can buy into that side of his rapping, but whenever he talks about hustling coke or blowing away his rivals, I find it hard to buy in comparison with other acts like, say, Schoolboy Q. At least at his peak, Rick Ross's appeal was that of the crime boss, but maybe it was just a lack of charisma or his inconsistent technique, or the fact that he was frequently blown off the stage by his many collaborators in the Master P school of making albums. But I was always underwhelmed by the guy. Where he wanted to come across as Vito Corleone, I always saw Luca Brasi. And when you throw in insulting trash like the "You Don't Even Know" verse from last year into the mix, and his complete lack of stage presence appeal in the 50 Cent mold, I was just about done with Rick Ross. And yet, he still manages to get positive reviews, and that utterly mystifies me. And since I'm always one to give artists a chance to surprise me in some way, I gave his newest album, Mastermind, a few listens. How'd it turn out? Well, it's a Rick Ross album. And after listening to this thing a few times, I'm just tempted to say it's not for me, stand up and walk away. It's not as if I haven't done that before. But it's the frustrating thing is that there are a few elements that I don't mind them on this record, and I figured I'd be doing less than my due diligence than to not give Rick Ross a full examination. On that note, this album isn't Rick Ross's best by a long shot, and in a broader sense, it's a pretty lousy luxury rap album that brings nothing really all that new to the table, and it's not a record that I can recommend. So okay, let's start with the element that I did find marginally appealing. The instrumentation and production were mostly solid. The standouts for me were from The Weeknd on his track and Kanye, as they both had some solid melodies and a pretty slick, dramatic vibe. Hell, if it wasn't for the fact that Rick Ross completely missed the point on Nobody, I'd say that Diddy collaboration really stood out for some real charged energy that I really liked. And I'll say what I've always said about Rick Ross's production. He has a taste for opulence and good samples of jazz and soul from the past that does lend his records some degree of character, provided then again that this is the very first Rick Ross album that you've heard, because on an instrumental level, we don't get a lot of innovation or anything that's outside of the norm. He's very much staying the course with this record. There are times here that are a little bit dirtier than his normal, but nothing that really gripped me all that much. And you know what? The guest stars in this album, they fall a lot into the same boat. Kanye continues to have personality, but he's still self-obsessed as always, and I'm starting to get a little bit tired of that. Jeezy does a decent job with a gangsta verse on War Ready, and somebody made the very smart decision to put French Montana on the hook so that any damage he might do could be reasonably limited. Now, the one who actually did surprised me in a good way was Jay-Z, who actually talks about some interesting themes regarding how systemic racism still exists with regards to stop and frisk in Brooklyn, the loss of black culture as one gets rich, and accusations of Illuminati just because he makes money. Sure, it's bookended by a load of luxury rap that doesn't really amount to much, but on a record like this, I'll take the insight wherever I can get it, because here's where we start running into problems, in the lyrics and in the themes. Now, I can think, by this point, any hip-hop fan can tell you that Rick Ross is very shallow, and his records are basically a wallow in luxury porn with a heavy dose of mafioso and gangsta imagery. And to some extent, there's a limit to how much you can ask for out of this kind of rap. You're not asking for deep, conscientious insight. But here's my issue. I don't think anybody told Rick Ross that, and this album ends up taking itself way too seriously in the reckless pursuit of wealth above everything else. And to some degree, I think that's intentional. Very early on this record, in the second track, Rich is Gangsta, Rick Ross equates virtue with wealth. And all of the religious iconography he appropriates by bringing all of that in, he's trying to stress the point that the ends justify the means. And since he hustled hard and got rewarded, God obviously favors him. It's almost objectivist in its equation of virtue equals success, no matter how you get that success. And that's kind of interesting on its own way. But here's the issue. Rick Ross supposedly gets the majority of his wealth as a cocaine seller. Except he doesn't, because there's no evidence that he hustled a single day in his life. And you know what? If it was just meant to be viewed as a decadent fantasy, it could be excusable. But it's not framed like that. This is Rick Ross's reality, and since this album has no self-awareness whatsoever, it's a reality that Rick Ross glorifies to no end with his religious imagery. And even though he mentions that drive-by attack from last year, the fact he brags about surviving it because he's just that much smarter than everybody else apparently, proves that he's learned nothing from that incident. He's not taking anything away from that deeper impact on his life. What's worse is that he attempts to talk about the dire straits of poor communities and Mafia Music 3, and then he blames Obamacare for not helping. He comes across with the level of insight of an average Fox News anchor. Rick Ross, you opened up a song with a bank account printout saying that you have a fantastically huge amount in your checking account, no less, for stuff that you would spend on a casual spending. Wouldn't you say that you would actually produce some earned virtue by, let's say, giving back to those poor communities so they don't have to hustle hard or go through that struggle that you plainly went through to get to the top where you are? Except there is no struggle here. When you listen to guys like Schoolboy Q or Danny Brown or even Jay-Z, there's enough detail and grime and texture to their stories to lend context on how they want their kids or friends in that community to not go through what they did. But with Rick Ross, he's got none of that insight. It's one of the reasons that it makes his Mafia fantasy such a badly told story. There's no drama to Rick Ross's story of wealth or being a gangsta, because his character that he's playing never suffers in the slightest. And his vague attempts at existential dilemmas, they just come across as unearned. And that's before we get to the Trayvon Martin comparison in Black and White, where he tries to compare himself to the average black man by saying that they all need to stay on point or be careful, otherwise they could run into the same issue. But the comparison doesn't work here, because Rick Ross has described himself in his songs as a murderous drug-dealing criminal, which is about the furthest thing you could get from Trayvon Martin. And you know what the worst part of it all is that Rick Ross, he ultimately doesn't redeem any of his shallower material with charisma or good wordplay or anything I haven't seen done on the past 5 Rick Ross albums. Simply put, on a very technical level, he brings nothing all that special or all that impressive to the table. And between bad rhymes, flubbed lyrics, and rhyming words with themselves and just not being all that interesting outside of luxury porn, it just doesn't reflect well. I don't see why I'd want to listen to him. And considering that Rick Ross repeats similar cliches on track after track, I just find this record coming out rather boring on a lyrical level in the end. So look, there's a way to make shallow material work right, and ultimately, if you do make it work right, I'll follow along with it. Kid Ink's album, for instance, My Own Way, it was shallow as hell, but it was well written for what it was. It was fun, and it was inclusive, and you didn't need a 7-figure bank account to appreciate the spirit and the content in the lyrics. Rick Ross, on the other hand, he seems to have bought into his own toxic myth of success, even despite the fact that he never hustled. And the sad irony is that it's just not all that interesting in the end. For me, this album gets a 4 out of 10 and no recommendation. Even if you're a fan of Rick Ross, he's done better. He's made marginally better albums than this, and outside of a few marginally interesting guest verses, there's nothing on this album that's worth a repeated listen. Skip it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there's anything I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or if there's any other albums coming out later in this year that you'd like me to cover, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. So until then, see you next time.